Mary Evelyn Tucker, welcome back to the New School at Commonweal.
Thank you, Michael. Wonderful to be here.
One of our very earliest New School conversations was with you about 10 years ago, with you and your husband John Grimm by telephone. And so you are returning as opposed to being a newcomer, but this is the first time we've had you in person.
It's lovely.
But I remember well, you and I were talking before we began, that there were 2 retreats that you were part of here. I think you remember at least one of them, where you brought Thomas Berry with you to Commonweal. And he sat in the living room over at Pacific House with us. And I remember that he came twice just because it was an honor that he came the first time. It was astonishing that he came the second time. And so I just remember this extraordinary man.
Yes.
Yeah. So we agreed, you were willing to do this with me, that one of the formats that we use here at the New School is what I call spiritual biography, which is really asking someone that I respect and admire a great deal how they came to be where they are. And so we agreed that that's what we would do today, and we'll do it within 2 hours. We hope to have a little time for questions at the end, but the real purpose is to get a high-quality video and podcast of your spiritual biography. So let's start with your current work. I'll just start with a brief description from your Yale biography. Mary Evelyn Tucker is a senior lecturer and research scholar at Yale University, where she has appointments in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, as well as the Divinity School and the Department of Religious Studies. She teaches the joint MA program in Religion and Ecology and directs the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale with her husband, John Grimm. Her special area of study is Asian religions, and she's done a lot of work on that. Her concern with the growing environmental crisis, especially in Asia, led to her to organize with John Grimm a series of 10 conferences on world religions and ecology at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard from 95 to 98. Together, they are series editors of the 10 volumes of the conferences distributed by Harvard University Press. And after the conference series, she and Grimm founded the Forum on Religion and Ecology at a culminating conference at the UN in 1998. They now direct the forum at Yale, where they also teach religion and ecology. And then a whole set of books that you have done together or separately. Tucker and Grimm studied world religions with Thomas Berry in graduate school and worked closely with him for 30 years. They are the managing trustees of the Thomas Berry Foundation. Tucker edited several of Berry's books, The Great Work in 1999, Evening Thoughts in 2006, The Sacred Universe in 2009, and with Grimm, The Christian Future and the Fate of the Earth, 2009. And Thomas Berry Selected Writings on the Earth Community, 2014. And you've just finished a biography, just sent out the 12 chapters on Berry. But as we were talking, and I knew this lineage a little bit, but I didn't know the sequence. Really the sequence for you is Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, Brian Swimme, and then your work with John Grimm. So you have a little, it's not called an acronym, but what's one of those memes that you can remember? It goes Teilhard, Berry, Swimme, Tucker, Grimm, right?
Something like that.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So it's a nice little, it's a mnemonic, that's the word I was looking for.
Yep.
Teilhard, Berry, Swimme, Tucker, Grimm. So that's just kind of a brief capsule for people. So let's start with your current work and the extraordinary commitment you've made to this marvelous book, Journey of the Universe, as well as the film about it. I want to start with a very specific question. I think this book is just so elegant. It's so beautifully done, and it's this incredible, creative, living imagining of the universe story as a story filled with wonder and awe that can be equally read by people of a spiritual or religious orientation, but also completely secular people who find awe in completely scientific and secular ways. How long did it take you and Brian Swim to write this book?
Well, the whole project, the film, the book, the conversations, curriculum, website, took 10 years.
Right.
So, but the book was the starting point in a lot of ways, although it was the script for the film and the book.
Uh-huh.
So those are slightly different,
Yeah.
actually. But that took many years.
Yeah.
Yeah. And but I think you've described it beautifully, that Journey of the Universe is an effort to bring us into this deep time, this evolving universe, the sense we're part of something unfolding, containing us, supporting us, and in many ways very new in its scientific iteration. Of course, traditional peoples and all world religions have cosmologies of origin and unfolding and where we belong, how we got here. But so the writing of this was an attempt to take the best of modern science, if you will, the best of evolutionary understanding that we have had. And that's, again, I keep wanting to emphasize, fairly new, but to take that and fuse it with, marry it with a poetic and imaginative sensibility. So every chapter has a scientific idea, but a metaphor so that the human mind can enter into it. And then, so what? You know, what does this mean for us as humans? So it's a new genre in certain ways, and some people, a lot of people love this book, and it's been translated into many languages, which is wonderful. But it's not science, it's not a NOVA type of presentation, and it's not just poetry. Lauren Isley comes to mind as the person who did this beautifully, and our editor at Yale gave us great joy when she took the manuscript and she was flipping through it, and she said, "This reminds me of Lauren Isley."
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it was a great gift to us.
And the film got an Emmy, isn't it, for the best documentary?
In Northern California,
In
there's
Northern
regional
California.
Emmys.
Yeah. And how widely distributed has the film and the conversations and the whole enterprise with the book been? How far has it gone out?
Well, you know, we've been quite lucky, I have to say, for two academics, three of us, John and Brian and myself, who had never made a film, and we won't probably make another film because it was so hugely demanding. But we've been fortunate, and I really do feel it's because the universe wants its story to be told, you know. So we're just vehicles for something much, much larger. So we were extremely fortunate. This is why we love Northern California and the energy here, but KQED, you know, picked it up. And every part of this journey has an amazing thing. There's a woman there who got it. 6 months later, she had moved on. You know, it's just sort of amazing. She got it, and then national PBS got it and picked it up, which again was a great gift. So that was on PBS for 3 years. So that's millions of people watched it over that period. We were able to get it onto Netflix. It's on Amazon streaming. It's been on Curiosity Stream and so on. All in these very mom and pop, you know, two distributors in New York who just believed in it and helped do it. And then I think, again, that we didn't ask to do this, but our dean at Yale really got this. He's a great paleobotanist, so he understands deep time, and he understands how he shows this one astounding opening of 100-million-year-old plant that just blows you away. You see, so he understands what it means to be, even in terms of our imagination and our knowing, to be part of this. So he asked us to do online classes, and so we've created these MOOCs, massive open online classes with Coursera. So it's again in West Coast, East Coast, Yale Coursera courses on the film and the book and the conversations. And those, in a year and a half, have had about 20,000 people watching them. and they're free with the audit. And then we had a Fulbright professor from Taiwan who was in our class, and he said, "This is great. Can I show them in my class?" And of course, this is all open source. And we took this to Yale Teaching and Learning Center, and they said, "Well, let's translate them into Chinese." So they've translated these courses into Chinese, and the film is dubbed as well. And so little by little, but I think we're going to make an even further effort, just to invite people. This is an offering for our moment, our planetary crisis, and just to invite people into it more and more.
So I've found that it's one thing to write something, a book or an essay, and then it's quite another what you learn after you've written it. So what have you learned from this 10-year immersion in the journey of the universe that you didn't know when you were writing the book?
That's a great question. And I should really back up and say for Thomas Berry and Brian Swim to write the first the first book, the Universe Story book that came out in '92, that took 10 years. Because Brian had to learn the science. He's a scientist of the early universe, but he really spent a great deal of time here in the Bay Area with other scientists learning this process over time. So that's a gift beyond measure. And I should also mention Brian, who's the narrator of the film, obviously the co-writer here, and has carried the story part of this for years and years. He is indigenous, and he doesn't speak about that, but his father is indigenous from the Salish peoples of British Columbia.
I didn't know that.
No, most people don't.
I didn't know that.
And we began the MOOCs with this because I think it was time to say, this isn't just a white male scientist telling a story. It's someone who comes out of another worldview, another universe. But I really want to say this would be impossible, and we can go into this more, without this Teilhard and Thomas, and especially Brian, bringing the science into availability for those of us who aren't scientists. So in terms of the learning of it, working with Brian was a great joy, and working with our editorial movie team was a great joy. So I learned a lot in both those processes, how you do take scientific ideas and make them more available. And then I think I've learned especially we've tried to hold open that space that, as you put it so well, those who have a spiritual feeling for this story or ecology, those who don't, to be extremely inclusive. Because some people have said, I'm just so inspired by nature, by these processes. And to me, it doesn't have to be pronounced as spiritual. And it wouldn't have gone on PBS if we had inserted something overtly spiritual and so on. So we really need to open up the windows and doors of that space. And one of the efforts I think that's emerging is a spiritual ecology movement here in Northern California. And if I'm okay to say so, Steve and this legacy coming from the geography of hope and trying to bring young people into that space. So Universe Story is a type of spiritual ecology, you see, but to make it more explicit in both schools and educational systems and in the immensely rich networks here will be a great gift.
You and I are part of a conversation with some friends online about the potential for the authentic collapse of Earth systems through a project called the FAN Initiative, faninitiative.net, which lists the 12 leading challenges to the global environment and the high prospect of collapse. And so one of the clear questions in the face of, I would say, the probability of deep degradation and possible collapse is, it's a trite question in a way, but can a change in human consciousness affect the trajectory that we're on? And, that's a very debatable question, whether a change in human consciousness is possible And if it is possible, can it deflect the trajectory? But into that mix comes the central question of whether science and spirituality merging into a single narrative, the journey of the universe, can actively co-create a consciousness that can do that. I mean, one could say that what is at stake in the journey of the universe is that it's one possible answer to the question of whether science and spirituality coming together to tell the universe story can in fact shift human consciousness. And if it shifts human consciousness, is it possible that that will shift the direction of a profoundly tragic trajectory that we seem to be on?
That's the question.
Right.
It really is.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that's the hope.
Right.
And as you've said eloquently in your latest essay, Havel has this sense of hope.
Yeah.
And it's different from optimism, and it's very deep and sometimes inchoate. We don't always express it well, but I think in the people I meet here and in many parts of the world, that hope is very much alive. And it is so alive with our students. I feel immensely blessed to have these very bright, the Yale undergraduate students are beyond scary smart. And the students in the environment school and divinity school, very, very perceptive. And they have not given up. And that is who we need to be in touch with. I like to speak of an intergenerational handshake. If we can inspire them and share our deep concerns, we haven't made it easy for them, but their creativity is astonishing. Even like with this Journey of the Universe, we've just finished a 6-week course where they watch these things online, we meet in class, and the students are so excited. Like one wants to do Instagrams to help get the MOOCs, elevated and things like that. But they have ideas across the board: fishing, forestry, endangered species, water issues. And they are working around the world, these students. And they have been around the world before they come to this is the oldest environment school in the country, and they've had amazing experience before they come. So I really do feel if we can ignite that energy in the next generation. And that's what Teilhard was about, the igniting of energy for this to go forward. So we are in E.O. Wilson likes to speak of it, the Harvard scientist and so on, that we're in this hourglass of going through a period of extinction, a period of loss, a period of trauma, tremoring, but that the FAN project is exactly identifying with that process. And I think it has so much to offer because it's putting forward, as many people are, we're in a moment of breakdown, but to break through. And I think that is the hope. And it's also why seeing the long-term evolutionary processes of universe history, Earth history, and human history gives us a trajectory, an arc of time that we can relate to, breathe into, get resilience from, and so on. So I'm not minimizing that this is easy, that there's not tragedy all around us, and that we nonetheless have to breathe in not just urgency and the freneticness, but deep time, change, well beyond our lifetime.
I agree with that. And one of the things I think we also have to be careful about, a friend of mine pointed this out to me, is to distinguish the, quote, decline of the West from the ecological issues. In other words, the West right now, the older generation of the West, feels this profound sense of foreboding about everything. Then, as you point out, there's a whole younger group of people who are much more hopeful, and as you point out, actively working on it. I mean, I think that's the difference. I've always said that the millennials are the generation I've been waiting for,
Yes.
because they share values
Yes.
with,
Yeah.
my age cohort, but they're much more practical, and they want to go do it. And it's not about ideology or theory. It's about, what can we actually do?
Right.
So I find that helpful. The other thing I find very helpful, which you know a good deal about, is that in China, the idea of creating an ecological civilization in China is a really big deal there, from the top down, and a tremendous amount of work being done. And the Chinese, to a significant degree, are quite hopeful.
Yeah.
And so, you have these very different mindsets, and so easy for us, situated, some of us, as older people in a, quote, decline of the West mindset, combined with the ecological, potential catastrophe, to see that as a global perspective. Whereas if we recognize that younger people are more hopeful, that people in other countries can be more hopeful, and that China is really going for this, And so it just gives us more of a sense of balance, I think, about.
I couldn't agree more. And I think we're in our American bubble, to tell the truth. And the news doesn't break that,
Right,
for so many reasons. And again, it's why I feel very grateful for the international conferences and the travel I've been able to do over 30, 40 years. Because I first went to Japan 40 years ago, 73, 74, and it changed my life. And so Asia is a huge part of my life and consciousness. And many times to China, because Confucianism is my first area of study, and so on, which we can talk about. But I really appreciate that you're putting eco-civilization into this conversation, because as you've said, it's in the Constitution of China that there is a right to a healthy environment. Of course, we know it's also in the Constitution of Bolivia and Ecuador now, rights of nature. But we're talking well over 1 billion people. And China and India will change the face of the planet. They already are. Our oil, that's going to China, tar sands and so on. So it's on the very highest level. Xi Jinping, with incredibly authoritarian problems now, but speaks about this all the time in the party. I've been to many conferences that are both NGO, academia, state actors, so to speak, that the whole focus is on this. Now, there's a piece of it which can be wrapped up in ideology, like all aspirations for change, but the Chinese know they are up against absolute limits. You cannot breathe in Beijing. There was a huge television journalist document film on, it was about 2 years ago, I think, Under the Dome. 30 million people watched this. You can still get it here. It was shut down after maybe 3 or 4 weeks. Under the Dome. And it was a woman journalist holding her baby up to the window saying, I can't take my baby outside. Riveting. People in the audience are just like this. And she goes through then all the facts. This is connecting to environmental health, clearly, and so on. Riveting. The Chinese know. And our sense, we got the Paris Accords for climate change because China came on board with the US. And that was a tremendous effort of Kerry and our whole team there in Washington. And then India came on board. We've got to think internationally for these problems.
Absolutely. So now I'd like to move into the spiritual biography, and I'm going to start with some very original, deep time questions.
Okay.
Where were you born?
New York City.
And what kind of family did you grow up in?
So I was born up near Columbia because my grandfather taught history there, which I want to talk about for a moment. But so I had an academic side on my mother's side and a lawyer side on my father's side. And but it was a Catholic social justice, progressive. You take care of the poor. If you are educated, you give back. Everything was for a common good. and Dorothy Day, and these were all part of our lineages and so on. And my grandparents were good friends with Dorothy Day and would bring turkeys down at Thanksgiving and so on. So it was this sense that, which is also very Confucian, if you cultivate yourself, if you have education, or what you get, you give it to the common good. So I know many, many people have more agonizing stories about their family, but I feel enormously grateful. No one's perfect. Parent is perfect, but I also feel it's very unusual that my father would have affirmed I had a mind, that I could actually do a PhD or a grad. That was still a difficult thing. So I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful for the fact that my mother wasn't just like, get married, have children, be a nice housewife, or what. I'm not knocking that either, but that's the short version of really terrific
Well,
parents.
you and I grew up in New York at about the same time.
Yeah.
And where did you go to grade school?
Well, wow, we moved out to the suburbs because the family grew, being Catholic.
Were you the oldest?
I'm the oldest girl. Boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy.
Okay.
And so we lived in a little town called Pelham, and I went to the public school there.
So what were you like in 8th grade?
A little bit rebellious, ready for the 60s, because high school was all about that for me, and college too. On the edge of feeling, going in and out of New York on the train and seeing Harlem and seeing the inequities, just like, why is this and why should it be so? And so I worked in these different summer programs for social justice and civil rights.
Even in 8th grade?
Yeah,
Wow.
I did.
Where did you go to high school?
So then I went actually to a boarding school that my mother had been to that was even more social justice conscious.
Which one?
It's called Holy Child at Rosemont College Nuns. And they were terrific. I mean, seriously terrific. It was a small school, and I think when you can get women, to feel empowered, because those years are very hard for women to feel empowered.
Yeah.
And so I took a lot of leadership roles of president of the class and this and that. And it was tremendous because it was all about, again, a concern for the larger world.
So how deeply did you buy into, or did your parents buy into, the Catholic trip, for want of a better word, beyond the Dorothy Day social justice dimension? In other words, I have many Catholic friends who have been through this, and as you know, Catholicism is a deep interest of mine. But where were you in kind of how bought into, let's call it conventional Catholicism, you and your family were, and what was your evolution through high school of that orientation?
Yeah, no, that's great. Because if it's only the social justice and political, we can get burned out.
Right.
And I think the gift that I had with those nuns and in other training was a very profound spiritual path. We had access to daily mass and so on, but it was more studying the mystics. It was a very intentional path through a tradition that is enormously rich, as we know, in that area. So I began reading Teilhard in high school.
Okay.
You see?
So you weren't being fed a conventional surface Catholicism.
No.
You were diving right into the mystics.
Yeah.
And did you have a taste for the mystics?
Totally.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I swam around there.
Okay.
Dived deeply.
All right. And during high school, did you begin to make the connection between Catholic mystics and mystics in other tradition?
That's a great question. I don't think, I would just say in short, not until I went to Japan later. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what were you like as a senior in high school?
Well, I was president of the school, and there's a lot of leadership that was put on my shoulders, which was good, but I was ready to go to Washington and go to college and get really involved even more.
Washington, D.C.?
Yeah.
Where did you go?
So I went to Trinity, which was the women's part of Georgetown. It's where Nancy Pelosi went and Kathleen Sebelius, and they were just a few years ahead of me. And so it was, and I went there because there was an opportunity to go to Oxford for the sophomore year.
Uh-huh.
And also because like the choices were between Mount Holyoke and sort of women's colleges in the Northeast, and I said no, I want to be in Washington for civil rights. Especially.
What year was that you?
I graduated in 71, so 67 to 71.
67 to 71. Okay. And what was the Washington experience like, those 4 years?
It was tremendous.
Yeah.
Because being from New York, I do love cities, and I think there's a lot of energy. So I love the museums. The civilization thing of Kenneth Clark was on at that time. I'd run down to the Smithsonian every week to watch that. I worked in Muskie's office. I worked on the Poor People's Campaign. All the great civil rights leaders were speaking. When King was shot, I was right downtown on 14th Street working on these campaigns. The city exploded. National Guard came in. You know, it was very intense. But it was also the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, which were huge. I was at the Pentagon with tear gas and all this stuff, and you know, my parents weren't thrilled about this, I have to say, but they didn't stop me. And it was so alive with the arguments of the time. You know, is this communism and domino theory and so on? But your cousin, your brother, your friend is going because of the draft. And so these two issues were just so alive. What's happening in our own country and why are so many African Americans being drafted and so on, and then what's happening around the world. What is our militarism, which goes on and on and on.
And what was happening to you intellectually and spiritually during that 4-year experience?
Well, I was fortunate to have this year in Oxford to study history and literature. And, you know, we can talk about privilege and guilt and so on, but this was a year that it didn't cost a lot for those times, like $2,000. And we were able to have boat back and forth, and we had a lot of travel in Europe, 6 weeks of art and so on, from Greece to Paris, and travel in the British Isles. So, and the year at Oxford. So that was a huge deepening in Western history and civilization and culture and tutorials at Oxford. You know, very demanding. But Bill Clinton was there. There was politics still swirling, you know, over there. But
Paul Gorman must have been there if Bill Clinton was there.
at the same time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. No, it was just, it was a very rich deepening of of historical roots and understanding, and also literature, which I completely love, you know. So, and learning to write in these tutorials.
I mentioned Paul Gorman. He went on to direct the National Religious Partnership on the Environment, which was a seminal piece of work in bringing the religions on board on environmental issues. Yeah.
Yes. I'm very indebted to Paul.
And he did that at Grace Cathedral in New York.
Cathedral of St. John the Divine.
Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, where Jim Morton was the dean, and Jim Morton was, again, a transformative figure. Paul Moore was the bishop.
Right.
And that was a period where the Cathedral of St. John the Divine had an astonishing cultural, political role in the history of spirituality and ecology.
Exactly, and I was at Columbia at the time, so I would go over all the time to Paul Winter's The Winter Solstice. Next year he's celebrating 40 years of the Earth Mass. Thomas Berry was a canon there and deeply influenced Jim and Mary Catherine Bateson and so many others. So yeah, it was an amazing period, 25 years at the cathedral there.
So when you graduated from college, did you go directly to Columbia?
No, I did a master's in literature first, and then I went. I was.
Where
I
did you
worked-
do that?
That was it. It was one of these efforts that came out of HEW to support community college teaching.
I see.
And I was very interested in the democratic processes of education.
Okay.
And so I began my teaching in community colleges. And this was at SUNY Fredonia.
Oh, wonderful.
A fellowship for that. So, and then I worked on the McGovern campaign. And when Nixon was elected the second time, I said, I am leaving the country because we could see Watergate, we could see it all happening through the campaign. And through Trinity in Washington, they had a college in Japan. And I went to teach at that college. And
that was the great opening.
that was the great opening. Yeah, yeah. Because, you know, our colleges, and even now, don't have a lot on Asia and Asian studies.
right.
So I felt completely a blank slate. And I just absorbed and absorbed. And it partly because I wasn't just disillusioned politically, but I was disillusioned with the massive attraction of materialism and superficial qualities of our society, which we all recognize. And I'm not knocking the U.S. and you know we have so much to offer, but it filled my soul in so many ways. This culture, the traditions, the people.
So that was a turning point.
It was totally a turning point. Yeah, 73.
What was the essence of the turning point in Japan? If you could point to one seminal experience or transformative awakening or whatever you would call it, what was it that was the real turning point there?
Yeah, and there'd be more than one.
Well,
but yeah.
give us several.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, one was I deeply immersed myself in Zen. And so I did a lot of meditation, and there was this one beautiful experience in Kyoto. I would go to Kyoto every weekend because the university was fairly close on the bullet train. And I just remember being there in the middle of winter. There weren't a lot of tourists in Japan then, and certainly not in the winter. And I'm sitting in this beautiful Zen garden and the raked rocks and the moss and the water and complete quiet, nothing around. And all of a sudden it begins to snow. And I just felt I was in another world, you know? And what those gardens bring out, of course, are, we can all say it and not say it, because I don't even want to give it words. But so Zen was hugely important. The other, I did a number of retreats through my own tradition, through Catholicism and so on, just for the silence, the space to read, to think, to pray. And then the great transition, I guess you might say, is I had been given some of Thomas Berry's papers before I left by Fanny DeBerry, Ted DeBerry, the great Asian scholar at Columbia, his wife. And these were family friends, which I'll explain. And Fanny DeBerry gave me Thomas Berry's mimeograph papers, the Riverdale papers, which I'm sure some of you have read. And I read them before I left. I was fascinated, but I didn't quite get them. I pulled them out of my suitcase and read them while I was there. And I was like, this insight is incredible. Because he was saying, he was balanced. You know, Western history has this trajectory of time and history and development and so on. And Asia has, at least East Asia, interiority and a meditational sensibility. But it was much more elegant than that. And I was like, I have to write him to get his book on Buddhism, which had been recently published. And the miracle of my life, Michael, is that he wrote back. Really. Just that he wrote back, you know, because that was the really big transition.
What year were you in Japan?
73, 74.
Wow.
So, and as I said, there weren't many foreigners, and you can imagine I'm 6 feet tall and different color hair and eyes. You'd come around the corner and people were like, Gulliver's Travels, you know? The first Japanese word I learned is takai. She's so tall. I'll just tell one quick story. Coming up to Tokyo in the summer with another woman who was teaching there with me, and we went to the Western Art Museum and we bought these Rodin posters to put on our wall, and just having this Western art after being so immersed in Asia. And we're sitting there in the subway, and the whole subway starts looking at these two foreigners, gaijin. And so we just put our posters and our rolls like this, and we just started turning this. It was a very humorous moment.
Yeah.
But it wasn't easy being, a foreigner in that culture.
No,
But
wonderful. So you came back with this transformative insight, and did that change what you did next, or did you know what you were going to do next?
Well, I also traveled extensively through Asia to come home. That back in the day.
Right, exactly.
So someone had gone this way,
Right.
Okay, from Europe all the way to Japan.
Right.
I met her at this Zen retreat.
Yeah.
And she gave me all the names of people she had stayed with. And so I went back that way through Southeast Asia and India and Egypt and so on. So that really, exploded my mind.
This was backpacking, kind of
Yes.
travel by bus, live inexpensively.
Yes,
India,
and very
so on.
cheap flights you could get in those days and so on. And I traveled with this Scottish woman who was just all filled with energy and a sense of adventure.
Right.
And it just exploded the notion that religion, spirituality is obviously hugely important around the world. And how can I understand this more? So that was part of the trajectory going back.
Yeah.
But I started with NYU in a program on theater, because I love theater. My master's I had written on Harold Pinter and the theater of the absurd and so on. I was very into existentialism and all that. And I thought, well, Asian theater, the No and the Kabuki, and it's just so marvelous and so rich. But NYU didn't have a feeling for the spiritual depths of these traditions. So after sitting on the floor in Greenwich Village for a semester, I said, I've been doing that for 2 years in Japan.
Yeah, right.
And I went to meet Thomas Berry, of course, during this period. And I remember the day, early February, beautiful winter, brilliant sky, overlooking the Hudson River, the Palisades, 150 million year old geological formations. I knew the moment I met him, this is my teacher. As many people felt about him and other people. But so he started teaching me Sanskrit, and I began to read the Bhagavad Gita and enter into these Asian courses. And I did my master's with him at Fordham and met John on the way.
Who was also studying with him.
He was. And he had been there since about 67. So he had been with him already quite some time, and a wonderful community of students developed.
So what was your first impression of Thomas Berry when you met him?
Just, he was a person who had charisma without showing it, because he was so warm and hospitable in a southern kind of way. So it was this sense of wisdom, learnedness. The library there at Riverdale, 10,000 books. You could just feel it oozing out. But it was a wisdom that was transformed into or made available to you and me, and especially something for our times. Not just for our enlightenment or well-being, which is important, but for these very critical times. And he was just...
So for those who don't know Thomas Berry, let's just bring him in now. Who was Thomas Berry?
So Thomas Berry was born in 1914, died in 2009, 94 years. He was a person from a large Catholic Southern family in Greensboro. Very small percentage of Catholics living down there, less than 1%. Again, I think he had a pretty healthy experience growing up. But his father really made him independent in a way, and he was very independent as a child. He entered a religious order because he knew he needed a place for contemplation and thought. And he entered a Passionist order, which is not like a Jesuit, a teaching order, it's a preaching order. And that had its challenges over many years because he was so brilliant. And he eventually was able to get a PhD at Catholic University, and he went to China in 1948, which transformed his life, with Ted DeBerry, this professor at Columbia, who's really the grandfather of Asian studies, who just died this past summer at 97, still teaching at Columbia. These two were friends for 60 plus years. They helped establish Asian studies at Fordham and at Columbia. But Thomas Berry went beyond just the study of the history of religions, which was the program he created at Fordham that was astonishing. Because he said it's not only human history, but earth history and universe history. And so in 78, a little 3 years after I met him, he did this new story essay that was a watershed,
Right.
breakthrough moment.
Was he influenced by Teilhard de Chardin?
Very much so. And in 1964, the first Teilhard died in 55, 1881 to 1955. His works weren't translated really until 1960 into English. 64 was the first Teilhard conference in the US. Thomas gave a keynote talk called The Threshold of the Modern World that blew people away, standing ovation. Teilhard was a huge influence. He was appreciative but also critical, which was also very helpful.
In which sense was he critical?
Well, he felt, so Teilhard had this evolutionary perspective, energy and matter over time and so on, but he also felt Teilhard was overly optimistic about technology and science as a techno-fix kind of thing. And Teilhard, even though he lived for many years in China during the war and was a paleontologist there, didn't appreciate Asian religions and culture and so on. And that's partly a function of the time. There's no truth in other religions until Vatican II. So those were some of his limitations. But nonetheless, the Teilhardian influence, and by the way, the beautiful essay on the cosmic sensibility of Teilhard that was written in World War I when he's a stretcher bearer. And he is seeing out of tremendous destruction and suffering, nonetheless, something's emerging, something's calling us forward. And that's what attracted me to Teilhard, that he had a really powerful understanding of suffering and tragedy.
So you were reading Chardin before you met Thomas Berry?
Yes, I started in high school and, of course, didn't
Yeah.
really understand him fully. He's very complicated. But I did really dive deeply into him in Japan. And I started with things like the letters. Letters are so fantastic, right? And he wrote letters to his cousins and family members who were suffering. The Making of a Mind is a really beautiful book. And then there's just a very short book called How I Believe. And he said, if I lost my faith in God, I would still believe in the world. He's like, that's pretty neat. He had a tremendous commitment to matter and this unfolding process. So yes, I had read Teilhard before meeting Thomas.
I know that you and your husband, John Grimm, have been foundational to the American Teilhard de Chardin Society. I read that John marked 30 years as president and received the Thomas Berry Award from the association.
Right.
And so your engagement with Chardin and Berry, as we're saying, and the differentiation that we're developing, both of Berry's appreciation for Chardin, for his deep time perspective, but that Chardin did not have an appreciation of the spiritual dimension of the Asian tradition so much.
Right.
I'm just reminded that for me, part of the Berry story is that our friends Fritz and Vivian Hull up at the Whitby Institute were also seminally involved with Barry and involved in, I think, the first conference up there. I don't know if you were there.
I wasn't, but I know what you're
Where
referring
Barry
to.
presented, and now there's a Thomas Barry Hall at the Whitby
Yes.
Institute,
Yes.
which is where all their gatherings take place.
Right.
So for me, since I spend about 3 months a year up on Whidbey Island, I'm very connected to that dimension, and,
Yep.
and have done a spiritual biography with Fritz Hull also, and
Wonderful.
so, who co-founded the Whidbey Institute and was also part of this movement in
Right.
ecology and spirituality that
Actually,
we're talking about.
No, I love that you mentioned that for two reasons. Because Brian Swim found one of Thomas Berry's essays at Whitby Institute.
Oh, really?
So that's a wonderful connection. And then we worked for, over that 10-year period while we were working on Journey of the Universe, every summer we would have a workshop up there with scientists, refining the science and the language and so on. So they've been a great seminal
The
presence.
seminal presence in this. So you finished your master's. What did you do next?
Well, it was the master's and then going to Japan. Oh, well, the master's with Thomas. That's right. There were two different. I went to Columbia. So Ted DeBerry, who was Thomas's good friend, had created, I still think, the best Asian studies program in the country, where you would have civilization and history, you would have reading of texts in translation, and I spent 8 years there. And
With a focus on Confucian?
well, you had to, the first year, you had to take major exams on all the world's religions, day-long exams and so on. So it was a pretty ferocious system. And in fact, it was so hard, I came in with like 12 other students, and I was the only one to finish after 8 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That is ferocious.
Ferocious.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
brothers called it sophisticated child abuse. But it was ferocious.
Wow.
Yeah. I could not have survived it without Thomas Berry, without John, friends, family in the area. It was very, very hard.
Wow.
But we could not have done the Religion and Ecology project at Harvard without that depth understanding of the traditions. And then what I had to do for my dissertation was take a Japanese text, translate it, annotate it, introduce it, comment on it, and so on. And so that took many years with a great Confucian Japanese thinker. I did one of those that was published a little bit later, and then another translation that took me 25 years to finish.
Wow.
So these were partly because, you see, we don't have enough translations, especially on the East Asian traditions of Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism even. We have more on India than we do on East Asia. So DeBerry created this huge translation of Asian classic series, which has been a great help for these studies. Yeah, and that's a story in itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what was happening to your own sense of religious identity as a born Catholic who wasn't doing surface Catholicism, had dived into the mystical tradition in high school? Did your engagement with Catholic mysticism continue to deepen throughout this whole period, or did it begin to move into other traditions with your exposure to Japan and the trip around the world and so forth? At what point did you, if ever, you begin to ask yourself whether your Catholic identity was a sufficient holder for your expanding sense of spiritual experience?
Well, Thomas Berry liked to speak about like a rose window where the center is a tradition that you might come out of it, and then the flowers are other traditions that are part of that. So, as I say, I've been fortunate to come out of a healthy Catholicism, which might be rare, unfortunately, I don't know. But I think I didn't, I mean, Hildegard of Bingen, things that came out later, of course, you're reading that, and what Matt Fox did with creation spirituality is great. What Richard Rohr is doing with the mystics right now is great. But Teilhard became my bass note, pretty much. And that was true for Brian, too. And so this little association, I've been vice president, Brian's been vice president, too, so we're carrying that lineage forward. And it's just 50 years old. And as I say, for 30 years we've been running it. But for 30 years we've also been trying to take that Teilhardian vision into the Barry perspective that we need to tell this as a story and so on. So, but I think the sacramental quality of Catholicism, you see, is what does resonate. And a Buddhist teacher at Columbia, after I had written a paper on Shingon Buddhism, which is the esoteric form of Buddhism in Japan, said to DeBerry, this is a good paper, and in part probably because of her Catholic understanding of ritual and the sacramental world, that's esoteric Buddhism. So I feel Catholicism gave me that ability to appreciate this in other traditions as well, and go forward with it.
Just as a sidelight of a certain kind, we haven't talked about Thomas Merton. Where does he stand in your pantheon of experiences?
Way up there. He's of New York and Columbia.
Yeah.
And I read his Seven Story Mountain in high school. I was deeply moved by him and continue to love his reflections. And he has a huge following. And of course, he was also against the war and for civil rights, the Vietnam War and civil rights and so on. And there's a beautiful little book on his environmental concerns. So if he had lived longer, there was no doubt that that would have been part of it. And he was already into interreligious dialogue, especially the Buddhists, when he died in Thailand. He was at a conference along those lines.
I've been reading his letters from that last journey. An extraordinary,
Yes.
before his death.
Yes.
An extraordinary piece.
So all of these traditions have been such a gift in my life.
Okay.
And so the container, and it's not just the traditions, and it's the earth. It's what's happening to the earth. It's the universe and so on. So these have been well springs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when somebody asks you to describe your spiritual orientation now, what do you say?
I've never thought about it exactly in that way.
Isn't that curious?
Well,
I mean, one would think, as one of the world's leading historians of religions, who's done 10 volumes on the world's religions and has done, has been seminal to Thomas Berry's work and to holding Teilhard de Chardin's work, and you're never asked what you consider yourself?
No, but here's the thing.
I'm glad to be the first.
You are, Michael. You absolutely are. May I shake your hand and thank you for the question? Because, no, honestly, here's the thing.
Yeah.
First of all, it's not that I'm not self-reflective on it, but I'm not publicly.
No, I understand.
Ever.
No, of course.
Serious? No, but this is the first time I've ever even talked about most of this.
Thank you.
And I trust you. I value this community.
Yeah.
I value Commonweal. And to speak with the I word, very difficult. And it's very difficult for a woman, in case you didn't notice, to speak with the I word. You see, to own your space. And that is something I do want to do, and I welcome this threshold moment.
Thank you. I'm honored.
It's I'm very grateful. And I'm grateful to all of you here, I'd love to hear your stories too. We tell stories.
And with
so
great
we can
skill,
grow.
you didn't answer the question.
To be continued.
Right. No, I love that. No, I mean, when people ask me, and I say this lightly, but I say I'm a Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, yogic Sufi with Taoist influences. That's my line.
I love it.
But what I mean by that is that in the course of my searching, my father was Jewish, my mother was Christian, and she considered herself, by the way, a secret Catholic, and Jim Morton was her confessor.
I love it.
Because when she married my father, she bought into a completely secular, progressive, sort of social democrat worldview, which is the one I grew up with. And so, but she was a secret Catholic. And so she needed to educate her children in a Catholic-informed spirituality without any of us knowing that she was doing it.
Interesting.
And so she did that by making a big deal out of Christmas and by getting us to memorize against our wishes some Psalms. But the result for me, I'll just say, is that where I am at age 74 is that these traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, yoga, and the Sufi tradition, each of them have deeply opened to me over, 40 years of intense exploration. And the Taoist one has not opened to me as much, and there are many others that haven't. But when I say that as this is every day, like right now, I've gone back to reading Torah on a daily basis, which I did for 2 years of depth work in Judaism, but haven't for a long time, but felt called back to reading Torah, which, but at the same time, I'm deeply immersed in Matthew Fox's Cosmic Christ. And for me, of all these traditions, what I call the living Christ is the lens. In other words, I believe, as you know from our conversations, I tend to believe, although I've been corrected by you, in the perennial philosophy that there is one truth and many paths to the truth. That's Leibniz, and Huxley wrote the book called The Perennial Philosophy. And in an online conversation, I mistakenly identified Thomas Berry with the perennial philosophy, and the perennial philosophy is the heart of all the great spiritual traditions. And you kindly said, no, Berry would not identify with the perennial philosophy. And by the way, Confucianism doesn't fit with the perennial philosophy, which, as I said to you, was a big surprise to me because I'd been holding this meme that there was one truth and many paths to it, and that the perennial philosophy somehow was present in all the religions. So this is all by way of saying that my question to you about how you would identify is a living question for me, but in saying that the living Christ for me is the particular fractal that comes out of a light that goes into all the traditions, which, by the way, is a very Sufi view, as you know. You know that's what the Sufis. I think that's the advance of the Sufi tradition in the Abrahamic traditions, that they really saw that there were prophets in every tradition. And obviously they privileged Muhammad, but they really recognized that all the traditions got their own prophets. So, so that was the kind of inner framework of my question to you. But when I speak of the living Christ, I realize more and more deeply that, and Brother David Standerast, in the spiritual biography I did with him, spoke of this, and he speaks of it. He says that, and Richard Rohr says the same, they say that many people think of Christ as Jesus' second name, Jesus Christ, But in fact, there's a tension between the historical man Jesus and whatever you want to call the cosmic Christ, And that the cosmic Christ concept is one that in the biblical tradition goes back to the beginning of time, right? Yeah. And so for me, when I say the living Christ, I'm not thinking of the historical Jesus so much. I'm thinking of the cosmic Christ. And for me, I can't separate the cosmic Christ from Krishna or Muhammad or Buddha or any of the other great fractals of this single truth. So when you said to me that Confucianism doesn't fit in this perennial philosophy story that I'd been telling myself, and when the great religious sociologist we were just talking, Robert Bellah, I did a conversation with him, also made fun of me for the idea that there was a single perennial philosophy. And when he did it, I kind of danced around it, but when you did it, I thought, I've got to give up this meme, And that was a big deal for me, And to be honest, I'm still wrestling with it, because I think what I would say is maybe the perennial philosophy is not at the heart of all the traditions, but they are all different at the mystical levels. They are all different expressions of the experience of the numinous and of expressions, I would say this, I'd be curious, of, a shared, I like to think that there's a shared experience. I like to believe that. I know that as academics who differentiate, you may not believe there's a shared experience, and that's okay with me. But anyway, I'll stop there. That's just like a little extended riff on my question to you.
Well, I appreciate your journey,
Yeah.
and I appreciate the depth of it,
Yeah.
the sincerity of it, the rigor of it, and many, many people, I think, are on their journeys, right, in various ways. And so I want to affirm that and the plurality of that and so on. I will say the cosmic crisis of the universe is a Teilhardian idea. It's very much, and this is where I actually want to move to the sacred dimensions of the universe. You see, that's where I rest my spiritual journey.
Right.
You see? And the traditions have informed that, but I don't stop with the traditions. That would be one way of saying it. So that all the traditions have had this rich, long, riveting journey themselves to express something and to change over time. And what we're trying to do in the religions and ecology is evoke them, midwife them into relationship with the mystery and complexity of our Earth and universe systems. And that is a spiritual ecology.
That's your resting place.
Very much so, yeah.
And I accept that as a beautiful resting place. I mean, I think one, in the Gita, there are three great yogas wrestling for supremacy: the yoga of love, bhakti yoga; the yoga of wisdom, jnana yoga; and the yoga of service, karma yoga. The Gita tells us that the greatest of those three is the yoga of love. And what it says specifically is that it's easy to get lost in the yoga of wisdom. It's an arduous path.
Right.
And I think that one of the things that the traditional religions give us in various forms is a personalization in the Buddha or the Christ or something, that some human being to relate to. And when I think I would love to experience the journey of the universe as my central spiritual home, because it's so clearly true and there are so many good things about it. But I miss that personalization that I think most of the religions give us.
Okay, but there's two things here.
Yeah.
Not all the religions
Give us that.
Yeah, because this is why I want to just talk about Confucianism a little bit.
Yeah.
But then also return to, or maybe punctuate it here, the Teilhardian vision of the interiority of matter, of matter and energy, spirit and energy evolving over time, is a profoundly spiritual journey. With, for him, a cosmic Christ infusing the whole universe. You can take this from a logos principle in John's Gospel, that there is an inner ordering principle to all reality. That's from the beginning of time.
Oh, I like that. Okay, that helps me.
The beginning of time that has a historical presence and manifestation, as you've just said, in Jesus, but throughout this unfolding universe, I would say there's something sacred evolving.
Oh, I agree. There's something sacred. How does the Confucian tradition personalize itself?
In the human
In the
order.
human. Right.
So this is why I like to, we generally speak about the world's religions through the lens of the Western religions.
Right.
And I like to say there's West Asia, Western religions, there's East Asia, Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, and there's South Asia, Hinduism and Vedanta and the Gita and so on. But these are very distinct patterns. And so East Asia has a much deeper feeling for the immanental quality of things, for the numinous right here and now, you see. And that, I think, is hugely attractive to me and to many others. And why is it that this is a tradition that's influenced more people on the planet than any other tradition over time and with numbers? So if you take its cosmology, you can say it has a sense of cosmos, earth, and human, right? So something guiding this process, it's called Tien, or heaven, but it doesn't mean heaven in our sense, but some cosmological principles. Earth, dynamic, fecund, unfolding. We need to harmonize with it. We need to identify with it. That's the I Ching. That's all of Confucian rituals. Space and time and directions and seasons and so on. It's hugely inflected into China and Japan and Korea. And then what is the human role then in this cosmological universe? It's an anthropocosmic worldview, so that the human completes this dynamic and unfolding process, that human action, we are co-creators, co-evolvers with this process, you see, so that all human action, so the concentric circles then within that cosmology, the human is not an individual, it's always in relationship. Absolutely, relationality is at the center. The family contains that and nurtures it. The society helps it to grow. The next circle is education, hugely important. Politics, nature, and the cosmos. Completely inclusive. You drop a pebble into this pond, and it's rippling and affecting, mutually affecting over and over again. One of the key circles, though, is education, meaning not just for a job or a technical skill, but for cultivation of the human to participate in these extraordinary processes right around us at Bolinas and the ocean and the redwoods and the species and the water and the fog and the food systems growing here and so on and so forth. That is the participation, or what Thomas Berry would call the great work. And linking this up is what we need to do right now. And it's why Confucianism, with every tradition has its problematic side, its women's sides, etc. But every tradition has these fountains of wisdom. And that is the engagement of relational resonance. We know indigenous peoples have it, but my thesis is on qi. Okay, qi is matter, energy. In the universe, in you and me, you can cultivate it through qigong, tai chi. You cultivate it in healthy food, clear water, systems that nurture the human. So qi is that relational resonance that can be cultivated, nourished, and you can create flourishing societies around it. And that is the Confucian vision. And it is a sense, ultimately, of the common good over individual freedoms. And I want to relate this to journey, okay? Because you're quite right in penetrating, Michael, in your sense that we need personhoods, we need a sense of person. But I think we also clearly need community.
By the way, I just want to say that was very beautiful, and it helped me. I mean, that felt like a big piece of help to me because I hadn't grokked Confucianism before in that way. But were you extending that sense of all the concentric circles to the Buddhist tradition as well, or is the Buddhist tradition different from that?
Different.
Yeah. How would you describe the Buddhist?
Well, the Buddhist tradition, see, the cosmology is different.
Yeah.
This is why cosmology is so important.
Yeah.
How you create your worldview
Yeah.
determines your actions and your energy for transformation. So again, we've got so many forms of Buddhism and Zen and esoteric Buddhism and so on, but in general, one could say that the great insight of Buddhism is the together rising up of things, the pratitya samuppada, the collectivity of interdependence, the interbeing Thich Nhat Hanh refers to, is a great cosmological insight.
And that's like what you talk about Prigogine in The Journey of the Universe,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Ilya Prigogine, who's, you'll say it better than I do, whose insight was self-organizing systems can
Yes.
come up from below,
Yes.
which is a central dimension of the journey of the universe. So that you find that in that Buddhist tradition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And see, this is inflected with
Right.
the interdependence we've just, Prigogine, a sense, we end the film and the book by saying, what if, I didn't say this about Confucianism, but the notion, the human is the mind and heart of heaven and earth. That's the Confucian notion. That's one character. So it's the thinking, feeling, completion of heaven and earth. And heaven is literally considered heaven as father, earth as mother. What a small child has a place in their midst. That's one of the most famous lines of Confucianism, and it's in this book. So, but Buddhism then has this profound insight into change and into the dynamics of interdependence. So does Confucianism. But Confucianism says we have to harmonize with change. We have to situate ourselves within the seasons, within the directions, within the animal powers, the bird powers, and so on. All of this is deeply shaped around our cultivation. Buddhism, by and large, of course, there's a mandala approach, there's a no thinking, clearing the mind approach, there's vipassana, watching things come up and down. But in general, it's to steady the personhood in this changing, dynamic, suffering world. So Buddhism, by and large, does not have a social, political, or educational philosophy in the same way Confucianism does.
Interesting.
You see? And that led to sometimes tension and sometimes complementarity. The richness of various forms of Buddhist meditation are almost non-paral, non-paral. So, but the Confucians and even my teacher at Columbia would sometimes criticize the Buddhists like, well, and then what? Enlightenment and then chopping wood or whatever. But it's like, how does this transform society?
So one of the things that has made, Arnold Toynbee's great comment that perhaps the most important event of the 20th century would be the coming of the Dharma to the West. And one of the things that has made Buddhism such an influential meme in the West is that it is non-theistic. It doesn't require a belief in a God. It doesn't require anything except a willingness to sit with your experience. Is that also true of the Confucian tradition? In other words, as a non-theistic tradition, Confucianism hasn't traveled the way Buddhism has, right?
Again, that's partly because the translations haven't been available.
I see.
You see. And Buddhism in its Pure Land form in China and Korea and Japan is the largest form of Buddhism.
Right.
And that does have a theistic dimension.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. But generally.
Yeah, the one that came to the West has been non-theistic.
Right. In general. And this is the point about the various paths, same experience. And I would suggest they're different, but and yet complementary. That's what I love about them. They're complementary. So Confucianism is not interested in personal enlightenment. It's interested in transformative change for a common good. That is a very different spiritual religious goal, right?
And isn't it quite behaviorally based? In other words, it's more about acts than about beliefs, or not?
Yes, you could say it's with orthopraxy, not orthodoxy.
Right.
You see, so it's what you do.
It's what you do.
It's very pragmatic, and sometimes it's called spiritual humanism, and so on. But it is this notion of relationship. So how you greet people. The Japanese is very inflected with a language, women's language, people above you, below. So there's a hierarchy there, but each thing has its negative and positive, right? So you have a role that matters and you're valued in these societies. So collective societies, which are very different from hyper-individual
Right.
societies, especially like ours, each are needed. But I will just tell you why Journey of the Universe has a practical value. So we had a student who came from Nepal to Yale, to the School of Forestry this semester, and we took her out to dinner with some other students, and she said, the first semester, I came from a very collectivist society, always with family and friends and so on. And I came here, and I actually had a nervous breakdown with the individualism. I just couldn't get it. That's pretty intense, because we think that's such a hyper value. It's a value, but it has to be contextualized, And she said, through this Journey of the Universe class, she regained a sense of her place and her purpose. And I want to just take this also to Carl Anthony and the work that Drew Dellinger, who's here, has done as well. So Carl, wonderful African-American, environmental justice at the heart, working with Drew on Martin Luther King and the environmental justice and so on. So Carl, as you know, has this experience of reading Alexander Pope, A Great Chain of Being, white people at the top, feeling excluded. He reads New Story, he gets into Universe Story, and he realizes, I can find where I belong here. Now, Carl's new book, Earth, City, and the Hidden Narrative of Race, is a fantastic breakthrough to do what we couldn't do in Journey or Universe Story, because we're just trying to get a 14 billion year universe out there in an outline form. But now we have to tell the story of the humans, all these different cultures and religions, but people in our society who haven't been included, African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and on, Latinos. So how does this give us a grounding for where we need to go forward? That for those who value, it's spiritually grounded, it's cosmically connected, it's ecologically relational, and it's humanly liberating, because it gives us a sense of our place, our role, our purpose. Because if we run out of not just fossil fuel energy, if we run out of human energy, that's part of the collapse. So in a number of cases, this has been quite extraordinary. I'll just end that part here. A former governor of New Jersey is showing this in prisons. In the women prisoned, I said, well, Jim, how did it go? He said, complete silence after showing the Journey of the Universe film. And this one woman says, they're actually crying. And she says, for the first time, I know where I belong.
How beautiful.
It's incredible. It's really incredible. So this sense that we're contained in something much larger than ourselves, that has a richness of its own self-organizing dynamics, but that our creativity can be aligned with this creativity. It's the most liberating things that humans can possibly begin to understand.
I think it's very profound. I'm realizing, I really think it's, in a certain sense, a shortcoming of mine, but one that I share with, I'm sure, millions of other people, that, it's funny, in our love relationships, we all have whatever you want to call love maps, which are actually extremely exquisitely tuned to the very particular kind of person or whatever experience that we fall in love with. And so clearly, in religious or spiritual terms, we all have our religious spiritual love maps, whatever they are. And those, the power of those archetypes is overwhelming, just as love is overwhelming. And so what I realize is, and I said it to you before, I deeply get that if everybody could have a love map, a spirit love map that embraced the universe story as its central love, that would be, transformative. I get it intellectually completely. I get it totally, that it's true, that it's both science and spirit, that it's all these good things. I'm trying to make space for it in my Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, yogic, Sufi with Taoist influence love map, so that I can embrace it as completely as I embrace Ibn Arabi or, Rumi or Hafiz or the people who Rilke, or the people who put me on fire, that where there's that fire of not just this is true, but this is a truth that enlivens me.
Yes.
And so I think that my problem is not recognizing that in addition to being true, and true as a story that goes beyond all the traditions, and true as a story that unites us all, it's also a story that does put a lot of people on fire,
Yep.
And so I'm trying to discover whether in my own religious spiritual love map, I can find the fire for something that I believe is both true, good, and beautiful, right? Those three criteria. Right. But I need to allow it to work on me in a way that it hasn't worked yet.
I think it's hugely helpful, what you're saying, because I would say there are millions of people in this this way of being in the world.
Right.
And again, it's partly why we did the religion and ecology work.
Right.
And this journey of the universe work. But maybe one of the links is the Teilhardian link.
Yes. Yeah.
Because Teilhard comes out of and yet flourishes in ways beyond the tradition, but is rooted in a language that's very Christian. But the people who are in, when Teilhard, 50th anniversary of Teilhard's death, 55, so 2005 in New York, we had 1,000 people at the UN to celebrate him and his vision, including 200 from France, including the former head of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, including Cam Dessou, the head of IMF. His influence on French intellectuals, European intellectuals, profound.
And they're among the most cynical people in the world.
Yes. Truly, it was amazing. Amazing. And there were things all over the city. John the Divine the next day, Helen Prejean, Dead Man Walking, she gets up there and she says, "We're blowing on the embers of a man named Teilhard." The ripple was incredible, and Brian spoke and so on. So that energy, and Teilhard was himself trying to do exactly what you're saying. Help us to
breathe fire into the universe story.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. And Thomas said we can't do it unless we tell it as a story.
Yes.
You see?
Beautiful.
So that's the link.
And that's what you have done with Brian Swim. And so let us, first of all, thank you. And let us open it up now for questions. And I'd like to ask people to say their names and keep it brief so we can hear from as many people as possible. Yeah.
I'm Wendy Johnson.
Yeah.
A number of years practicing Zen Buddhism, and really happy to be here today. And I love it that Michael just mentioned the love story. Could we hear how you met John Grimm, please?
Now that's a great question.
Please.
Well, I come
Sorry
back.
not to be religious.
No, of course, it's fresh. I came back from Japan. I went to Fordham. I felt Fordham was a little, the Catholic thing and the theology thing was a little too much. But Thomas was there. I was thrilled to start studying. This is September. I'm doing my Sanskrit thing with another teacher who's also a graduate student. And the door opens, small little office. John Grimm blows into the room, long beard, cut off shorts, his dog Mindy on this long rope. And he says, "John Borelli, do you have a piece of paper and a pencil? I'm going off to the class on religions of India. And I need some paper." And I was like, I could breathe. I was like, if someone like this is in the program, I can deal with it. And it's also love at first sight.
Wonderful. Others? Questions, comments? Yes.
Kathy Harris, do you have a daily practice for feeling the fire of what you've been speaking of?
Yes, definitely.
And
Yeah.
could you speak to what it is?
So I do a number of things, but basically I light, it's pretty complicated, so I'll just give you the outline. But I light candles in the living room. Two are incredibly beautiful angels from my grandmother and that kind of thing, and I light them for my husband. It's complicated, but so I light candles. Well, actually, it's for health of body, for peace of mind, for serenity of soul, and joy of spirit. That's the basic
beautiful.
4 candles. And then I light candles for the ancestors, and then one for all those of past generations and future generations, one for those doing the great work right now, and one for the hidden heart of the cosmos, the fire. And then I pray in the 4 directions with water. And again, I have light and hope from the east, courage and strength from the north, creativity and joy from the west, peacefulness and transformation from the south. And then that's the minimum to begin the day. But then I take incense and go around the house and bless parts of the house, and then I do some qigong and some quiet meditation and so on.
How long does the whole thing go when you can?
It's accordion. It can be stretched. So a minimum would be 20 or 30 minutes, probably.
To an hour?
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Other questions? Anna, you must have a question.
Got burning questions. So my name is Anna O'Malley, and I I was raised as a Christian, and I'm deeply drawn toward grounding the love that I resonate with, both in the natural world and that Christ consciousness in service. And I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on, or practices, or frameworks for infusing this sort of this beautiful narrative into the practical work of shifting consciousness?
Certainly. Namely, so the whole idea here is great story, great work. Teilhard was all about the loss of energy between the 2 world wars, existentialism, the collapse of European society, civilization. It's pretty intense. And he was like, we must dynamize human energy. That's his whole point. And Thomas in that lineage, very much so. So what we did with Journey was a film, as you know, the book, but these series of conversations where the scientists, I think, are part of the entry. You see, if we listen to them with a spiritual mindset, and they start to talk about these self-organizing dynamic processes, we can link into a spiritual ecology that's very profound, very profound. Because all the world's religions are dealing with forms of nature and renewal, return, life, death, you see, that kind of thing. So now we have universe powers, earth powers to connect up to our own spiritual consciousness. So that's part of it. But the second part of those conversations are 10 environmentalists, including Penny Livingston, Jim's partner, and what is permaculture? How do the systems of Earth instruct us in growing something healthy? We have Richard Register doing eco-cities. We have Carl Anthony and Belvie Rooks doing How Does This Matter to African Americans, and 2 incredible Native Americans. We've got Drew Dellinger doing the arts and poetry, and it's so fabulous what he does, you know. So all of this is to say, of course, it has to connect to the diversity of the talents and gifts that we can evoke. And even, I mean, Teilhard had this incredible sense of location. And I'm not saying it all has to be elevated. He was like, every part of work is important. It's very Buddhist too, you know. So I hope that helps a little bit. Yeah.
True, since you've been invoked several times, have you been reflecting on anything?
I would, well, I don't, I'm a little bit on the spot, but I will go to my one of my pet interests, which is the connections between ecology and social justice and cosmology. And it's very I'm so glad that you've done this. It's great. I mean, I've been a huge fan of Mary Evelyn for so long, and yet to have this afternoon to really hear more of her intellectual and spiritual journey and biography is really touching and fantastic. And just, I'm thinking about, I just wrote an article on the Poor People's Campaign. I'm like, I should have asked Mary Evelyn Tucker about the Poor People's Campaign. But I would love to hear any thoughts that you might be moved to share in terms of how you see this connection between racial justice and social justice. And you've already touched on it in terms of identity, but I guess I don't know, I'm not articulating the question clearly, but so much of what we need, you know, so many of us feel that if we don't have a movement, we're not going to make it, you know, in a certain way. And it's hard to even articulate exactly the movement that we need because it connects economics and ecology and social justice and racial justice and gender oppression and dismantling patriarchy with, you know, transcending militarism and brutality and war and all of these, you know, so it's hard to even begin to articulate, but just how can new cosmology help us build a world of racial justice and gender justice and species biodiversity in the next 15 to 50 years before everything unravels?
Again, it's the crucial question.
It is the crucial question.
So many of yours are, Michael. Well, it's why we're trying to elevate the MOOCs, these massive open online classes. You know, this is not about us and even these little lectures. It's just if we can get to the fire, we have the technologies. We have ecological economics, Richard Norgard. We have so many amazing ideas and practices already. And this is one of the most creative parts of the country that has them, right? So what principles, strategies, and tactics is what Thomas used to talk about. We've got lots of strategies and tactics and brilliance and even funding and so on. But the principles, if we can link these up, and some of the principles rest in this new cosmology. They absolutely rest there. And it's differentiation and subjectivity and communion. You know, respecting all this difference, understanding interiority and understanding communion. But I will really say, unless we honor the interiority of everything, we won't make it. And in part, one of the things I did want to mention is there's a flourishing of this literature now. Peter Walburn was just up at Geography of Hope and at the bookstore, The Hidden Life of Trees. David Haskell has a book, The Song of Trees. We just had at Yale, Eduardo Kohn, Thinking Like a Forest. These are leading edge ideas, ancient and new, filtered through a scientific consciousness and a living earth consciousness. So that is what has to break through. We're going to do a small conference to network these people, you know, David Abram and Sensei Earth people like Stephen Harding and all of that. You take it for granted. Bioneers takes it for granted. You know, all our relatives. Yale hasn't got a clue about it. And I live in a world that is the dead matter world.
Yeah.
I'm Dick Jackson. I have done environmental public health. I'm a pediatrician. I'm also a member of the FAN with the two of you. And it's a pretty depressing group sometimes. There are 12 elements, and it's the nitrogen cycle and the food cycle and pandemics and the Ponzi scheme that is our economic system. And I was really taken with your sense of interiority and hope. In medicine, when the patient is really often in bad shape, and that is what has to come before the recovery, the crisis, if you will. And we've forgotten so much in medicine about actually taking care of sick people, but often the old docs would know what that course is. And I think we're very close to crisis. Jim Kunstler says, well, basically the human species is a mistake, and don't worry about saving the earth. The earth is going to shake off the human species the way an old dog shakes off fleas. It's very easy to become desperately pessimistic, and I think this is the medicine that our species needs at this point, that what you've been talking about.
I so appreciate that. That's because it's literally, we are trying to say it's an offering, it's an antidote. But I just love your term medicine. It's very touching. And I want to, if I could, or you have a question, then I'm going to tell a story or two.
Yeah.
Is that all right to conclude?
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, go
Diana?
ahead.
Well, I feel like this is wonderfully inspiring. I'm going to read the book. I'm just very concerned about democracy and religion, and I'm very aware that in Europe and in developed countries where religion is less prominent and science is more prominent and secular spirituality, so to speak, that democracies and everything is much healthier and there's less inequality. I'm very concerned about the split here. You say Yale doesn't get it. Well, we've got people running the country that it's Fox News running the country.
Yeah.
What effect can this story have on people that are denying evolution and climate change? I mean, we're kind of leaving out the country we're living in this whole 2 hours, and it's not a fault, but I'm so aware that we are in a country that's different because it's so religious. And there's a book called Fantasyland that says how America went haywire. It's because when you're so religious that your worldview is denying science, you're prey to all kinds of conspiracy thinking and Alex Jones and everything that we've got.
Yeah.
So this feels, hey, if Yale doesn't get it, what about the rest of the Christians or the other Christians in the country?
Well,
the government.
There's a couple things here, and thank you for that question. When I say Yale doesn't get it, and we both share Yale in our background. Yeah. So what I'm saying is excellence is measured in different standards and categories that are silo thinking, disciplinolatry, tenure for publications, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also this sensibility that the students get this in a big way, that we're part of a living universe, we're part of living Earth systems. It just isn't dead, therefore we can't exploit it and destroy it.
My question is more about the rest of the country, not Yale.
No, I understand. Just wanted to clarify that part. And, as I've said, I was hugely political in the 60s. And we are going through, we're doing this work to respond to those questions, but we are not going to fix those questions for sure. Because we're trying to really provide something that's a healing vision for massive fragmentation, for massive alienation, that is expressing itself now, but it's been present our whole lifetime. White supremacy's been present our whole lifetime and way, way beyond. So I feel, and in part, I don't want our minds and energy to get so wrapped up in the political disaster that we're experiencing that we lose these longer term questions and thoughts. That's my point.
Absolutely.
And if we do, we collapse into despair, you see? But every society has had to live through very intense things. So we need long-term vision of change. We have the short-term visions over and over again. And the pessimists who are part of our fan project, these are some of the greatest, the best, Paul Ehrlich among them, fantastic. But we need to include other music in this symphony. And if we don't get it up to a symphony, it's going to be a cacophony of tragedy. And we don't need that. And it doesn't have to be self-fulfilling, you see? So a science-based ecology is necessary but not sufficient. And the scientists who are stepping up at this moment out of AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, now led by Roy Holt, who was a politician he's a physicist and a congressman from New Jersey, has opened up the space that has never been there before for scientists to engage in public discussion on these issues. Because the other part of these institutions that we share there's no public advocacy. There is no public advocacy in these universities. But what I'm saying is the scientific mentality is you get your NSF grants, you do your objective research, you get your labs and your students, but you do not say that your research on air pollution around the world is so massively horrendous that we've got to do something. So science and policy are way divided. This is a problem. You see what I mean? So it's multiple, but the breakdown and breakthrough that is happening is astonishing. You had it in California with the AAAS, here demonstrating down at the big conference center. They were in Boston too. They're running for office. It's first time. It's fabulous.
Yeah. I'd love to just ask, there are a few other younger people in the room that we haven't heard from. I just want to open the space in case either of the two of you, I'm seeing you there, has anything you'd like to say or question. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I could ask something.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there's a rise of spiritual ecology happening right now in our time on this planet. I'm curious if you see this sort of secularization of wisdom to be necessary to shift our consciousness so we could have a more mutually beneficial relationship to Earth, and where does the journey of the universe particularly fit within that, I guess?
Yeah, and so Steve Costa, who's sitting right here, who ran Point Reyes Bookstore with his wife and so on, we just had a meeting this morning. I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but yeah, so why don't we just have Steve
At a very practical level, the Black Mountain Circle, which is a nonprofit, is undertaking a major initiative in documenting over the course of the next 6 months best practices here in Northern California, identifying leaders, programs, teachers who are focusing their work on primarily young people, high school through millennials. And our intent is to create a Northern California collaborative in which we can begin to encourage greater communication, networking, shared experiences. And so we're in the middle of, or the beginning of embarking upon this research, and I'm hoping by the end of the year, we're gonna be convening groups of teachers and practitioners around this growing movement. And in light of the fact that Northern California is such an epicenter for spiritual ecology, we just think that there needs to be some greater connection made with folks that are out there doing practical, important work.
And Calliopeia Foundation has provided spiritual ecology fellowships, right? So anyway, this is very exciting. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you, Steve.
Did you want to?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. It's been amazing to hear everything you've had to share. I'm curious a little bit about what role you see in, we've talked a lot about sort of a personal experience of religious traditions and how that personalizes this sense of the universe story and why we should care about all of these things. And I'm curious what you think about the role of personal experiences with nature as well, because I feel like we live in a society that's increasingly urbanized, and not just in America but around the world, and people are not necessarily interacting with the natural world on as direct and daily basis as they once did. And so how do you see increasing how do you see that playing out and getting people fired up about all these questions that you're talking
Great
about?
question. Thank you for both of these questions. And I think spiritual ecology will also be working in that space, and what Wendy Johnson's done with edible communities and teachers, getting them to think about gardening. And TPL, Trust for Public Land, does a lot with public space, of course, in cities and gardening. So it's a very important question. And while I hesitate to go to any technological solution, but I don't think we can we can rule out that the films we now have about understanding some of nature's processes are quite extraordinary. And I think if we can meld that with the affect, the knowledge and the affect coming together, and that if we can open up the space for all of us, not just young people, to say, to honor and embody wonder, that's the most important thing. And I mean, you're in one of the most beautiful parts of the world, and just driving down here was like such a gift, you know? So if we activate wonder, that's an energy that is continually replenishing itself. So opening that up, and again, see, some science teachers have said to me, I love this film. I can't talk about wonder in my classroom. You see, that's a mentality that the next generation is breaking through. Please, you know, like, of course we can. But wonder, awe, and beauty are the most regenerative energies we have to do this work. So, yeah.
James.
And just building on that, I had some curiosity about your thinking around the role of the arts and artists, and
Yeah.
where do they fit into
Hugely.
this?
Yeah.
And what are you seeing maybe is happening that's contributing, and what could be happening on that level?
Yeah, no, that's great.
Like connecting the community, the scientists and the activists.
Totally. And that's why we did an interview with Drew, you see, on the arts and on poetry and so on. So I think poetry, music, sculpture, painting, and so on, it's just, and a lot of it's exploding. You know, we were just at MoMA in New York last week, and there's some pretty cool stuff that is really bringing in the environment, you know, and they're using technology to do it. It's so amazing. It's really amazing. We have an oratorio on Journey of the Universe right now. It's called The Emerging Universe, and that's been done in Vermont. It's been done at a huge Jesuit conference last summer, to be done at the Big History Conference in Villanova, and that's an offering. Paul Winter, you know, has been doing this forever, as we mentioned, his winter solstice. He's creating that space. It's extraordinary. So yes, and more yes, because that's what people feel.
Last question for you, and then I have two final things. Yes.
I have a big concern about the wonder and the awe and technology. Can you help me with that?
Well, I share that hugely. And I didn't grow up with television. We don't have television. I don't watch a lot of movies, as we were discussing earlier. I'm very averse to shudder with violence, you know, and I've tried actually consciously to keep that out of my life, so as to keep a certain type of, I'm not saying it's pure and unadulterated, but to keep alive a genuine wonder and a genuine awe. But as I've just said, you know, I wanted to mention this film on Lynn Margulis that's just coming out on symbiosis, on the cooperative universe. And, you know, she's the one with James Lovelock who came up with the Gaia hypothesis, but her work was all about symbiosis and cooperation. And this film is fabulous. So, you know, technology can serve us, and she's making a huge, I'll tell you more later, but she's making a huge link here overtly to a neo-Darwin viewpoint that it's a dog-eat-dog competitive universe, and she's saying no, and look at this symbiosis. So everything in balance.
I guess I'm more concerned with the mind-brain changing through cell phone activity.
Yeah. It's very real. It comes up at almost every presentation I do. You know, this question of nature and so on. I think the biggest problem is no space for quiet or reflection. That people don't even know how to be quiet. And we're all part of it. You know, the onslaught of emails is ever present. And so I don't have an answer, right? But we do have many traditions which have spiritual practices which are also present, and people are flocking to this. our young people are just frantic for what I think spiritual ecology can offer, is this space of reflection and connection. We need the reflection, but we need the connection in a new and fresh way. I think we can do this. I think we can do it.
Two final questions. One, a specific one, going back to our earlier conversation. In the journey of the universe, there's a place where you touch on the fact that if it had been 1 degree less or 1 degree more, it would have either exploded or collapsed back on itself. And it struck me when I read that in a certain way you were tiptoeing around the anthropic principle issue, which, as many people know, is the theory that the universe appears to have been perfectly designed for life, and potentially even for human life, as the capacity for the universe to look back on itself, as Thomas Berry originally said. And so then we have Stephen Hawking and the other physicists who, from my point of view, and he just died and I think he's extraordinary, but they couldn't stand the anthropic principle. And so almost in response, they had to invent the multiverse, which was the theory that, no, it's not possible that the universe was designed to support life. So it must just be one random universe out of 10 zillion that happened to do that.
Right.
So my point of view is they haven't proven the multiverse, and the universe that we can see seems to be designed to support life. And so going back to your point about, the passion to merge, which you have in here, isn't it possible that the living universe that we can see is based on the principle of love, which is, the passion to create? And so if we see not only, because you were talking in the book about, the hypothesis that the Earth is a living system, I don't remember that you touch on the possibility that the universe is in some sense a living system. But Dwayne Elgin and others, as you know, are talking about, and you said some of your students see, the universe not as an inert system, but as a living system, which I would add, others do too, perhaps based on love as central. So I'm just curious where you stand on that question of the anthropic principle of the existing universe versus the multiverse. I can imagine you didn't want to get into it because it's a controversial area, but I'm curious whether you've thought about it.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the film, we do the balloon, which it would explode or collapse,
Right.
And we also put in Freeman Dyson, who
Oh, okay.
said the universe must have known we were coming.
Okay,
which
beautiful.
is a strong anthropic principle.
Right.
So yes, we did put that in. Yes, some scientists are uncomfortable with it, and yes, some scientists are fine with it, because as you've used that beautiful term, there's a fine tuning of the universe, right? And coming back to the living, we can all say at this point the living Earth systems and so on. And certainly this is the point, where does the fire rest?
Right.
And Teilhard has discovered the fire for the next time. The fire is there from the beginning,
Right.
the great flaring forth. So the sense of the interiority of matter differentiating over time, complexifying to greater differentiation and greater consciousness, that's the Teilhardian vision. That's cosmogenesis, which our recent ancestors had no idea about. That's what's so thrilling. So the sense that the whole universe has interiority and complexification and emergence and self-organizing dynamics. We can spend the rest of our lives connecting to that spiritually and being lit up by it. So that is, I think, one of our great tasks. And Brian has a great series, by the way, called The Cosmological Powers, where he relates transformation and so on to explosion of stars or formation of galaxies. And by the way, we spent a semester at Princeton teaching, and that's where a lot of this galaxy formation star is going on. Fantastic lecture from one of the leading scientists there, saying, we don't really know how galaxies emerge. And that's where we can begin, our humble investigation of this amazing process.
So coming back for a final question to your spiritual biography, What does the next chapter in Mary Evelyn Tucker's spiritual biography look like? Where are you going?
Well, I actually now want to write a few small books, okay, not academic books, and along the line of spiritual biography. And one, I definitely want to make available Confucianism, you know, on a richer way that takes out of its text and tradition. One, I want to actually write letters to both family and friends. Just, you know, the letters to a young poet, Rilke just had such an impact. So letters, that's a genre we've lost, and encourage letters. And another one might be, I've had it in my mind, is oases and places I've been grateful to travel to, the Silk Road and elsewhere, and just try and capture some of those place-based but spiritual experiences. So anyway, it's a little, and actually, just to conclude your generous question, is I very much want to speak with and for women. I really, really want these voices, you know, to emerge. And especially because I know as an academic woman, my voice, as in here, it's always very much buried. So I just want to help these voices to emerge.
Mary Evelyn Tucker, senior lecturer and research scholar at Yale, co-author with Brian Swim of The Journey of the Universe and probably 20 other books and hundreds of articles, and really a formative force in spiritual ecology and our collective prayer that the journey of the universe helps us find our way home. Thank you for being with us at the New School.
Thank you so much. Great questions. Thank you all.